Last week we looked at a lesson from Matthew chapter 8, verses 1 through 17 about Christ's authority over diseases, and we looked at three examples there in that first part of the chapter about how that Jesus, after he had delivered, according to Matthew's account, the Sermon on the Mount, goes down to Capernaum, heals these people, and the people were amazed because he spoke to them as one having authority, not as what they were used to with the scribes and the way that they would teach. And I pointed out that what Matthew chapter 8 then does is transitions from the words of Jesus and his teaching to actually carrying out his authority in action. So you had those three examples of healing infirmities, sickness, and such, and the great work that was done by Jesus. And today we want to look at Jesus' authority over his disciples, and again, these are seen in three little vignettes. You know what a vignette is? Just kind of like a short story. They all kind of go together, they fit together, and Matthew, even though he doesn't record things in an order like I believe that Luke does, yet he gives information in such an exciting way to hold the audience, so to speak, to hold us as we read it and as we understand it, kind of spellbound at what he's kind of weaving together. Okay, while we're talking about it, context. I've talked to you about context before. You know where that word comes from? You break it down and you look at T-E-X-T, and that's kind of like textile, isn't it? Okay? And textiles are, you take the material, the raw material like cotton or linen or whatever, and you kind of get it together, and it's woven together. And that's what context is, especially in the Bible, as we're talking about it. As all these things come together, they form just like a quilt. You know, ladies like to make quilts. I guess some guys do too. But there are things about quilts, you put them together, the many different pieces to make a whole quilt. And that's what the Bible writers are doing. It's taking all this textured, textile context, they're putting it all together in such a way that forms one great unity of thought and purpose for us to understand. So in Matthew chapter 8, verse 18, Matthew tells us, now when Jesus saw a crowd around him, he gave orders to go over to the other side. They're kind of on the northwest side of the Sea of Galilee at Capernaum, and they're going to travel over to the northeast side, over to the land of the Gadarenes. But that's a story for another time. But he gives orders to go over to the other side, and they're going to do it by boat. Now, Jesus wasn't somebody who would hang around just because there was a crowd listening to him. Now, understand that. When he saw a crowd around him, a bunch of people, and he's there, he wants to preach and he wants to teach. That's what he's come to this world to do. But he's got this great crowd, and he says, time to go to the other side. Can you believe that? Leaving a crowd of people? Well, why would he do that? Well, sometimes a crowd will draw to see something, not necessarily to listen to a message. And we've talked about that before, how you separate disciples from just the thrill seekers, the people there to see a miracle. Jesus is healing people. He teaches with authority, but he's healing people. He's taking away their infirmities. He healed a leper, you know, and they're there to see possibly a miracle, but they're not, maybe not listening as they should about the message that he has brought, this message of salvation, the gospel message, the good news of salvation and reconciliation having come in the form of the Word who became flesh, Jesus, it's for all people. It's for all people. And yes, there's a crowd here, but no matter where there's a crowd, there's a whole bunch of people somewhere else. And you never know where the fertile ground is going to be. After his resurrection, Jesus gave another command, Matthew chapter 28, verses 19 through 20. He gave it to his apostles, "Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all things whatever I've commanded you, and behold, I'm with you always to the end of the age." So those who would follow Jesus need to be seeking the lost. And that's why Jesus could leave a crowd of people that's probably heard his message, heard the very basis of the message, and maybe they're not really receptive to the message. They're just there to see Jesus do a miracle. Well, some people who believe can't go very far, can't do very much, but we need to go where we can, and we need to do what we can. Now, I think that's why Jesus said, really, if we looked at that in Matthew 28, as you're going, we're going through this world, we're going through this fallen world, and we've got so many opportunities to do good unto other people, but also opportunities to teach about the truth of God's Word. And you think about the parable of the talents, Matthew chapter 25. One fellow was given 5, another was given 3, the other fellow was given 1. And the one who was given the 1, he was probably given 1 because he couldn't go very far and he couldn't do very much, but there was something that he could do, but he refused to even do that. So he went out and he buried the talent in the earth. And of course we know the judgment that came upon him. He knew what his Lord commanded him to do, what his Lord expected him to do, and he just refused to do it. So we have to understand that ourselves, that as disciples of Jesus Christ, there are just some things he expects of us, no matter how far we can go, no matter how much we can do. Those willing to sacrifice were the ones Jesus wanted for a special mission, though. And listen, not everybody is cut out to go halfway around the world to preach the gospel. It just isn't. Life's circumstances sometimes don't allow it. But again, there's always opportunities around us. But what Jesus is doing is kind of sorting out people for the coming events that he sees on the horizon, like his death, burial, and resurrection, like the persecution that's coming upon the church then, and maybe even coming to the church in our day. One person that he was talking to in particular, one of his 12, Judas, he didn't last, did he? He didn't last. He failed. He failed because of so many probably different reasons and attitudes. But you know what happened when Judas failed? 2 others were ready to take his place. One of those was chosen to be an apostle in Acts chapter 1, to take his place. That's the beauty of God's kingdom, that the work is going to get done, but we need to step up and do what we can do. So whether one serves at home or around the world, the qualifications for discipleship are simply the same. Luke chapter 9, verse 23, and he said to all, notice that, he said to all, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. We can do that if we're going halfway around the world on a mission effort. We can do that in Stinnett. We can do it in Pampa. It doesn't matter where we are. God expects us, Jesus expects us to do that. So let's get back to the story. And remember where we were. Jesus gave an order. Get in the boat. We're going to the other side. and people started lining up to get in the boat. Verse 19, and a scribe came up and said to him. Now imagine this. Here's Jesus. Jesus is probably sitting in the boat. His 12 are getting in the boat with him, and people are lined up. And here comes this scribe. And the scribe says to him, "Teacher, I would follow you wherever you go." Now, what was a scribe? A scribe was a very educated person. The essentials of it, he knew how to read and write. If you didn't know how to read and write, you couldn't be a scribe. It's kind of like the notary public of our days, even though we don't treat them as, as such. But they were someone, typically they had studied and taught the law of Moses. That was their important job. They would copy the scriptures, but they'd also, because they would copy it, they would know where information was in the scriptures, and they could relay it to people. But they ran around with the Pharisees, and remember, the Pharisees were not known for humility and sacrifice. They were very prideful. The sacrifices that they wanted to see was the sacrifices that they imposed on others. So what was this guy thinking? Well, he probably thought he could connect with an up-and-coming young rabbi. Maybe he could be his scribe, write down his words as he's speaking, take note of it, and maybe, he could write his biography, and he could be a famous author. Perhaps Jesus' personal secretary, sending out letters to whomever. But Jesus, instead of looking at him and saying, "Hey, you're a scribe, you could be very important for my work," listen to what he told this man, what would be like to follow him. Matthew chapter 18 and verse 20, and Jesus said to him, "Foxes have holes and birds of the air have nests, but the Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head."
Don't you mean Matthew 8?
I did say, yeah, it's Matthew 8. I said 18. I don't know why I got 18 up there. What? Well, I'll have to go back and fix that. I'm sorry. So Matthew 8:20, okay. I'll follow you anywhere, Jesus. And he tells him, "I don't have a home. I don't know where I'm going to lay my head down tonight. I don't know where I'm going to sleep tonight." That's discouraging, isn't it? No house, no office, no motels, no RVs, no restaurants, one set of clothes maybe. We don't know that Jesus had more than one set of clothes, the clothes that he had on his back as he traveled around. Yes, that's discouraging. But Jesus was looking for disciples. He wasn't trying to win a popularity contest. You know what the working man's definition of vanity is? Buying stuff that we don't need to impress people we don't know using money that we don't have. That's it. So you think about this scribe. What's he wanting out of discipleship? And how does that differ maybe from what Jesus is teaching? And what Jesus is saying is those not willing to make sacrifices are soon going to fall by the wayside. They're going to fall. They're not going to last. So this man made a bold claim of discipleship. "Master, Lord, I will follow you wherever you go." Jesus says, "Really? Really? Here's what it's going to be like. Can you do that?" You know what? We'll get into the next story next time about the storm. This man didn't get in the boat, did he? Jesus, I'll follow you anywhere, but he didn't get in the boat. Matthew chapter 8, verse 21, another of the disciples, now catch that, Another of the disciples said to him, Lord, let me first go and bury my father. Go and bury my father. And something you read that and you think, oh, his father must have just died. Hey, give him a few minutes to go bury him. No, that's probably not what he's talking about. He's probably saying, my father's pretty old and he's going to die one of these days. Wait until I go and he dies and I bury him and I get the inheritance. And then I'll come and follow you. And that seems to be the point that this guy is making. This man was waiting for an inheritance, but Jesus calls us when he needs us, not when it's convenient for us. Did you ever notice that? Sometimes we call them inconveniences, we call them aggravations. You know, these are little things that pop up every now and then that, you know, oh, I got my day planned out, and here comes something along the way to just mess it all up. Well, as disciples of Jesus, we never know when we've got to shift gears because we're going to have something greater to do. Jesus calls us when he needs us, not when it's convenient for us. And a great example of this is Acts chapter 24 and verse 25. As Paul reasoned about righteousness and self-control and the coming judgment, Felix, the governor, was alarmed and said, go away for the present. When I get an opportunity, I will summon you. King James Version says, when I have a convenient season. Christianity is not about convenience. Christianity is born out of an inconvenience. It's convenient to live in this world and try to get along with everybody, just, you know, go along to get along and what have you. But when it comes right down to it, it's not convenient. A disciple of Christ must be ready at any time for the call, for a particular call. Not just to become a Christian, but again, Jesus said, get in the boat. I will if, I will when. You see what's happening with these disciples? Well, Jesus' command came too suddenly for this man. He may have thought that his father would cut him out of the inheritance if he followed Jesus. And you know, a lot of people who became Christians, a lot of the Jews in that first century in Jerusalem who became Christians lost everything they had. They lost their jobs, they lost their families, they lost their homes. They were cut out of wills. You know, the same thing happens today lots of times because somebody doesn't like that their son or daughter became a Christian, so they just cut them out of the will. We'll teach them. Okay? It happens. That, you know what? That's persecution. Well, this man didn't want the persecution. He was going to wait until he got the inheritance. Matthew chapter 8, verse 22, and Jesus said to him, follow me and leave the dead to bury their own dead. Well, that seems pretty brutal, doesn't it? But his father wasn't dying at that point in time, wasn't dead at that point in time physically. But what Jesus is talking about is spiritually. Let the spiritually dead bury the spiritually dead. And what he's saying, get in the boat. You got a job to do. There's a more important thing to do. Come with me and I'll make you fishers of men. That's what Jesus told his disciples. See, they had a different idea of the kingdom than what Jesus did. Matthew chapter 19, verse 29, Jesus said, and everyone who has left houses or brothers or sisters or father or mother or children or lands for my name's sake will receive 100. How many friends do we make when we sometimes have to walk away from a group of friends that don't have our best interest in mind, don't really care for us, would persecute us for being Christians. Those are the type of people that would really harm us and hurt us. And what Jesus is saying is, you're going to be part of a family. You can trust to be a part of that family. So there's nothing more important for us than serving God. That's the reason why He created us, was to serve Him. This man was anxious about security, wasn't he? He wanted to have that inheritance before he went off to do something with Jesus. So, how do you think he'd have acted in that boat in the storm that we're going to talk about next week? How do you think he would have acted, as insecure as he was? I mean, it was bad enough for the 12. What would have been with him there? Jesus calls people into the ark or boat known as the church, His church. Some will be making excuses why they cannot follow Him. And that's a shame. It's a shame when we think about it. It's Matthew chapter 8 and verse 23. When He got into the boat, His disciples followed Him. Remember what Jesus said, John chapter 8, verses 28 and 29? If you continue in my word, then are you my disciples truly. Or indeed, King James says. And I think that's what happens here. There's a separation, right? Here are a bunch of disciples, a crowd of disciples. They're learning about Jesus. They may not be on the same wavelength. Jesus says, let's get in the boat, let's go to the other side. His true disciples get in the boat and go. But the ones who are weak in faith, the ones who are weak in understanding, they don't get in the boat, they don't go. They just stay there. What happened to the people who didn't get in the boat when Noah called them? Preached to them for 100 years. Get in the boat, get in the boat. And that's what Jesus does for us today. Where does it start at? 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 21. Because, in Noah's day, here's the argument that Peter's making. This is what happened in Noah's day. But he says, baptism, which corresponds to this, now saves you, not as a removal of the dirt from the body, but as an appeal to God for a good conscience through the resurrection of Jesus Christ, who has gone into heaven and is at the right hand of God, with angels, authorities, and powers having been subjected to Him. The authority of Jesus over disciples. Catch those three little pictures there. The crowd, the call to get into the boat, and then you get the ones that say, wait a minute, I'll follow you anywhere. Here's what's coming. You sure you want to do it? He didn't get in the boat. Wait till I bury my father. Wait till I get the inheritance. He didn't get in the boat either, did he? But the ones that got in the boat, you know what? They were truly Jesus' disciples. But here's the thing. I like the sign out there. There was a greater adventure coming. And we'll talk about that next week. If you have a need this morning, let your request be made known as we stand and sing the invitation.